final keynote speaker is Dr. Thomas Sikor. Professor Sikor is Professor of Environment and Development at the University of East Anglia School of International Development. He has worked on resource rights, governance, and institutions with an empirical focus on forestry, agriculture, and land use. Using a grounded political ecology approach, his work engages questions of environmental justice and injustice, environmental governance, and participatory decision-making. He has worked on community forestry and its lessons, and with the UN RED program as well, on the development of a socially just benefit distribution system for RED. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Rinku. Thank you very much to the conference organizers for inviting me to come here. What I want to present today is the result of a think tank. So it was 11 people sitting together in a room for 5 days and thinking together about global land governance. You see the names of the 11 people up here. I'm not going to read them. It is really a collective product. I consider myself a rapporteur of our outputs, but I'm definitely not the sole author. Also, in the spirit of this think tank, I'm going to present it as a kind of think piece to you. So I think some of you may be disappointed because there's no data that I actually present. There's no graphs, no numbers, and so on. And I want to basically highlight the qualitative messages that we thought would be important to send out. I'm going to talk about global land governance. Some of you may ask, what kind of global land governance? Is there global land governance? Because we know there is no single global level organization that deals with land. I mean, FAO, for example, is not that. There's also no single set of global level rules about land governance. So when we talk about global land governance, we talk about it in the sense of systems of rule at all levels of human activity. So all levels of human activity. We're not just talking about the global level. We're also talking about local, national, and global level activity, in which the pursuit of goals through the exercise of control has transnational repercussions. Yeah, so we're not just talking about the global level. We're talking about global scale and a sense of scale being made through actions at local, national, and global level. Also, one thing you will notice when I talk about land governance today, I will talk about it in basically two senses. I will talk about land governance in a wider sense of any kind of governance that influences decisions people make about land use. And a lot of that you will see doesn't necessarily have the explicit purpose of influencing land use. And then I'll talk about land governance in a more narrow sense of governance rules that are being made with the explicit purpose of affecting land use decisions. So I'll use it in my talk by talking about governance more broadly, and then land governance when I mean governance that has explicit purposes affecting land use. And I want to share 3 arguments with you that we developed in this think tank. The first one is that global governance or changes in global governance, current transformations in global governance enable, at the same time are influenced by revalorizations of land. And here I'm connecting quite a bit with Tom's talk this morning. And these two together drive this intensifying competition over land that we are witnessing and that many of us study. The second argument I want to make is that what we see as a result of this dynamics is a shift in land governance. I'm talking about land governance in a narrow sense, from quite exclusive focus on territorial governance to flow-centered governance. What I mean by that I will explain in a second. And these dynamics together lead then to new forms of land use, then involve new forms of exclusion, inequity, and ecological simplifications. So let's start with the first argument I want to develop. And the first argument, as I said, is that changes in global governance enable and at the same time are influenced by revalorizations of land, and these two together leading to intensifying competition over land. When I talk about revalorizations, and that's a little bit different from Tom's talk this morning, I talk about changes in quantitative value, so monetary value. So for example, if agriculture terms of trade shift, or if energy prices go up, that's a change in quantitative value. But I'm also talking about changes in a qualitative sense. So if people attribute new kind of political and cultural significance to land, for example, new meaning to land, and that is also included in our term of revalorization. Let me illustrate this argument. And one example that many of us are familiar with is this large-scale land acquisitions in agriculture. And what's driving it, and Tom has talked about it, is that land is revalorized. The value of land is being increased because land is, again, increasingly seen as a productive resource in an economic sense. But also land takes on a new significance again for national food security in a political sense. So it's not just economics driving it, right? There's also politics behind suddenly states being interested in land in other countries as a signifier of national food security. So there's this change in value, but this change in value comes together with changes in governance at global, national, and local level. So at the global level, one example is the World Trade Organization, WTO. But this is accompanied by changes in national policies. So, for example, national policies that allow land acquisitions by foreign actors. It's accompanied by changes in land markets, so the spread of commercial land markets on the ground, which involves changes in governance on the ground and so on. So it's the two together then driving this competition over land that many of us study, so that has, for example, informed the debate about this increase in interest in agricultural land. Does it lead to unused land being used, or actually what are the prior uses of this land? What are the effects of small holders and so on? Another example, and again I can just refer to Tom's talk, comes from this increasing demand for alternative sources of energy, biofuels, and so on. And the third one I want to use again as an example is this increasing interest in land as a provider for the provision of cultural, environmental, and social services. So, for example, I'm thinking of the European Union, which for a long time doesn't see land anymore just as a productive resource, but both countries, governments, people, and various kind of institutions also emphasize the social services land provides, so for example, in terms of supporting smallholder agriculture, the environmental service in the sense of an agri-environment, the culture service in terms of a landscape that is trying to be protected. Interesting in this context is to see what's happening in Central and Eastern Europe, and some of us here have studied that in a sense of seeing this massive change in the way land is being viewed in Central and Eastern Europe after 1990, away from seeing land only as a productive resource to seeing land as something that provides multiple kinds of values, and the changes in governance that came along with it. You find similar examples in the minerals, hydrocarbons, and forestry sectors. So, for example, if you look at minerals and hydrocarbons, you see this change in the value of land driven by the need for material inputs for electronics industry, for example, but also, by people increasingly valuing gold, for example, as something that provides a safe investment. And so there are these changes in value, but these are enabled by changes in governance at multiple levels. So, for example, big mineral corporations can access stock markets to finance explorations in many countries, governance granting them licenses, granting them land rights to actually do the mining, corporate social responsibility, CSR, on the slide, provides social legitimation to do that, and fiscal reforms make local governments interested in accommodating mining companies coming in to establish mines for local economic development and so on. Another example are forests, and that has been mentioned in both previous presentations by both Sonia and Tom. So we see that forests are being revalued at a global scale in a sense of being not just providers of timber or maybe non-timber forest products, but also for climate change mitigation and hydrological services. And this is, again, enabled and leads to changes in governance at the global, national, local level. So, for example, we see that in a sense in the voluntary carbon sector. We see that now happening at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And we see that through various initiatives of payments for environmental services and so on. A third area where this becomes apparent, and that has not really been mentioned this much this morning yet, is that land is also increasingly being seen by some actors as basically containing important cultural and political values. And a good example of that is indigenous peoples mobilizations at local, national, and now transnational levels that emphasize the value of land not as a productive resource, but the value of land as something, as a place of belonging, as a spiritual site, and as a kind of territory to govern. Yeah? And that's what's driving a lot of indigenous people's demands. And you see consecutive changes in governance. One very obvious one is this United Nations Declaration on the Right of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, on the slide. You see locally that indigenous territories are being established in many Latin American countries, for example. You see in the co-management of protected areas, or this idea of indigenous community conserved areas. And so governance changes at the local, national, and global level are enabling these changes in value. So these changes in value are not happening automatically, right? It's not just the price going up or down, but it's actually changes in governance enable these things to take hold, and it's changes in governance at local, national, and global levels. Another example is the women's land rights movements. Again, it's not so much about women getting access to land as a productive resource. Yes, that's part of it, but it's also land as a signifier of emancipation, of empowerment, and so on. And the third one comes from community forestry, and I just did a study with RECOF, so the Center for People in Forests in Bangkok, and we looked at community forestry in 13 countries of Asia Pacific. The interesting thing is community forestry is interesting for many people still as a kind of, because it creates access to forest products and so on. So it's interesting for material reasons. But in many places, people are also seeing community forestry and access to forests, so land, as important for cultural reasons, for political reasons, and so on. So community forestry no longer is just about land holding trees and holding other material resources, but land being a signifier of wider set of values. Now let me go to my second argument. What we say is that these dynamics, so the changes in governance, in wider governance, plus value of land, leading to a shift in governance that we see land governance, or governance that has the explicit purpose of influencing land use decisions, a shift away from territorial forms to flow-centered forms. So what we mean by territorial, are the classic forms of land governance, and Sonia has just explained them to us, right? Is land use planning, is land policy the nation state does, actions undertaken by communities and so on. That's the classic territorial form of land governance. But this is increasingly being paralleled and maybe even replaced in some places by flow-centered forms of governance, land governance, the particular flows of goods and resources. And I'll give you examples for that. Yeah. So one example is if you look at the global agri-food industry that is becoming increasingly concentrated in a few big multinational, transnational corporations, is that they issue standards for production, for sustainability, quality, and so on, food safety, that are becoming much more influential in influencing land use than the rules that governments or local communities would make. So these industry-led approaches to production sustainability standards are gaining significance. A similar thing we know from our everyday lives and so on are NGOs or multi-stakeholder certification schemes that influence how agriculture products, food, are being produced. Yeah? So that promote organic production, they promote slow food, they promote fair trade, they promote local sourcing. These becoming increasingly important. An example from the mining sector are the voluntary guidelines by the International Council on Mining and Metals, which are voluntary but which have a significant influence on the activities of mining corporations around the world. And in forests, we know there has been forest certification for a long time. Again, that's something that really targets a particular flow, right, of a material, of timber and so on. So forest certification is a good example. RED, I think, is another example that we have to see the way it develops, right? I think Sonia right now basically has made a case for RED, basically taking on a very territorial form of governance. That's quite possible. It looks like this in many, many countries. But it could also, and I think the way it was originally designed was much more flow-centered around carbon. You want to incentivize carbon, and you basically, what RED focuses on just carbon. And we have to see where RED goes, right? And current discussions at the UNFCCC about so-called co-benefits, what is really that we want to produce, and what's happening nationally, and as Sonia also said, locally, right, will determine what kind of governance we see emerging around RED. And does it take a more kind of territorial approach, that is focused around local governments, communities, nation states in an integrative way, or is it more flow centered around carbon, for example? These flow-centered arrangements are complementing, in some places are kind of replacing territorial governance, but territorial governance is still significant. And so the classic territorial arrangements that we still see in many places that matter are protected areas, land reforms implemented by local governments, is zoning regulations, zoning ordinance by local governments, and so on. Sonia has run us through them already. And the classic form of territorial governance is complemented by new instruments that territorial governance would use. And again, we have heard about them this morning. So, for example, payments for environmental services. Another example are revenue sharing arrangements around protected areas, where protected areas would use income that is derived from tourism to share that with local communities. Another instrument that is interesting to look at in that regard, and I think Brazil is a good case for it, is interfiscal transfers that are being used to incentivize local governments to do certain things, taxes, ecological taxes, subsidies, and so on. Okay, let me go to my third argument. The third argument was about what does it all kind of lead to in terms of land use, so it is affecting incredible changes in land use, as we know, and as many of us study and we've heard in this conference. But these are involving new kind of ecological simplifications, new forms of exclusion, and new inequities. The ecological simplifications are clear to many of us, right? I mean, we know if, for example, RED promotes a strong focus on carbon, that may lead to the simplification of forests to kind of being provider of carbon absorption and carbon storage and so on. Or we know if agriculture crops prices are increasing, if there's increasing demand for biofuels, that may lead to deforestation, may lead to kind of landscapes that are becoming much more uniform and kind of agriculture deserts that do not provide other kinds of environmental services, ecosystem services. So this is what we mean by ecological simplifications. But in addition to that, I want to highlight that this change in governance from more classic territorial governance to flow-centered is also promoting new forms of exclusion. And that's on the one hand, it's exclusion of smallholders and other kind of poor, disadvantaged people. And there has been a lot of attention to land grabbing, right? And what land grabbing, what that usually refers to, is the dispossession of smallholders by large-scale land acquisitions and so on. Yes, I mean, that is of concern and that is of interest to us. But exclusion happens in many more forms than just straight-out dispossession, right? And that has been studied, and we know. So, for example, unfavorable terms of trade for smallholders is leading to exclusion. If smallholders have a more difficult time to access output markets, or have a more difficult time to get inputs, have to pay more for inputs, that is leading to exclusion of smallholders. Or predation by state officials, which is happening in many countries, China, Vietnam, and so on, where basically the key source of land grabbing are often state officials and not foreign corporations or large-scale acquisitions and so on. Another example that has been studied is stringent production standards that are being imposed for example, by the European Union purchasing agricultural products from around the world and demanding certain quality standards that smallholders have a difficult time to meet. Yeah? So this shift to flow-centered governance creates these new forms of exclusion, of particularly of smallholders and other people. Another effect is the marginalization of cultural, ethnic minorities, and people have shown that, for example, for certification of forests, that the certification requirements are manageable for larger scale operations, but the smallholders have a difficult time to meet those standards. For example, it has been shown by Daniel Kluster for Mexico. In the mining sector, people have shown that, yes, mining companies may now evolve into corporate social responsibility and may abide to those voluntary guidelines that have been issued for the mining sector, and may share benefits with local communities. But what are the effects on those local communities? For example, communities that are not part of the monetary economy yet, what effects does it have if mining companies then ship out cash to them? Or what effect does it have if governments grant land concessions to them on terms that are not familiar to local communities, that communities sign off 50-year land leases, 100-year land leases in situations where there is actually no concept of land ownership yet. So this informs the shift to flow-centered governance is creating new forms of exclusion and marginalization. Interesting thing is, that people are reacting in a way, and much of this flow-centered governance is heavily dominated by industrial interest, and by interest in the north. Yeah, so there are profound power inequalities in this flow-centered governance arrangements. And we see political reactions, political struggles in response, for example, around this right to food movement that has involved actions at the local levels of food rights we've heard about in some countries, has involved civil society resistance, mobilizations in many countries, has gone up all the way to the global level in the sense of, for example, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to food. So governance is responding to these political reactions and political struggles. Or another example, I think that's interesting to witness right now is in RED, how forest people and their supporters have mobilized in response to RED and have taken advantage of what's happening on the ground, in many places in the so-called RED demonstration projects at the national level in discussions about RED, and at global level at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, at this conference of parties, and have brought their concerns up and made them get integrated into governance at local, national, and global level. And so, for example, the safeguards, so-called safeguards on RED Plus, are evidence of that. All right, so in summary, what I try to kind of convey to you are three arguments about global land governance. The first is that changes in wider governance are enabling and responding to changes in the values attributed to land, which together then drive this increasing competition and struggles over land that many of us study. That land governance in a narrow sense is shifting from territorial forms to more flow-centered arrangements, and that these changes in governance and value cause land use that involves new forms of ecological simplification, inequities, and exclusion. Thank you.